Someone you love is gone. The body is still there, and you have no idea what to do next. That moment, that paralyzing, silent, horrifying moment has been happening to human beings for a very long time. Longer than you probably think. What your ancestors did in that moment is so strange and so unexpectedly tender. It is also so deeply revealing about what it means to be human that it will change the way you think about death entirely. Because here is the thing most people get wrong. They assume that ancient humans, the ones scraping meat off bone, running from predators, barely surviving each season, didn't have time to grieve. That burial rituals, mourning, and ceremony were inventions of civilization. Something that came along with cities and temples and writing. Something sophisticated, something modern. The evidence says otherwise. The evidence says that long before your ancestors built a single wall or planted a single seed, they were carefully, deliberately, lovingly tending to their dead. And the proof of that is sitting in caves right now, waiting for you. About 300,000 years ago, in a cave system in South Africa called Rising Star, researchers made a discovery that shook the entire field of human evolution. Deep inside the cave, so deep that reaching it required squeezing through a passage barely 18 centimeters wide, they found bones. Hundreds of them, belonging to a species called Homo naledi. Homo naledi had a brain roughly 1/3 the size of yours. They were small, strange, somewhere on the distant edge of your family tree. By every scientific assumption at the time, they were not supposed to be capable of symbolic thought. They were not supposed to be capable of intentional burial. And yet, there they were, placed in the dark, in the deep, far from predators, far from any obvious practical reason to carry a body through a nearly impassable tunnel. Those bodies were put there deliberately. That is not accident. That is not instinct. That looks a lot like reverence. Your instinct to do something when someone dies is not a cultural invention. It is older than your species. Now consider the Shanidar Cave in Iraqi Kurdistan. In 1960, archaeologist Ralph Selecki was excavating a Neanderthal burial site when he found something completely unexpected around one of the skeletons. Enormous quantities of pollen, clustered in patterns that suggested flowers had been deliberately placed on or near the body. The image immediately gripped the public. The idea of a grieving Neanderthal placing a bouquet of wildflowers on a loved one felt almost unbearably human. Later researchers challenged this. Some argued the pollen could have been carried in by burrowing rodents. The debate has never fully settled, but what no one disputes is this. The burial itself was intentional. The body had been placed in a deliberate position. There were grave goods nearby. Something was being acknowledged. Something was being marked. That something is grief, and grief, it turns out, is ancient. In Sunghir, Russia, about 34,000 years ago, 2 children were buried head-to-head in a single grave. Around them, researchers found over 10,000 mammoth ivory beads, carefully crafted fox-tooth pendants, carved animal figurines, and 2 straightened mammoth femur bones placed alongside them like spears. Crafting those beads alone would have taken tens of thousands of hours of labor. Tens of thousands of hours for 2 dead children in a world where survival itself was a daily struggle. That is not practicality. That is love expressed in the only language available. That is a community deciding consciously and collectively that the people they lost deserved something extraordinary. They were not disposing of bodies. They were saying, this person mattered. Across multiple prehistoric cultures, from Neolithic Europe to ancient China to indigenous communities in the Pacific, archaeologists have found evidence of excarnation, the deliberate removal of flesh from bone, either through exposure to the elements, through birds, or through the hands of the living themselves. This is not violence. This is ritual. The skeleton, the permanent part, the part that lasts, was considered the true resting place of the person. The flesh was returned to the earth. The bone was preserved, sometimes kept, sometimes passed between generations, sometimes painted red with ochre and reburied in a second ceremony months or even years after death. The skull of an ancestor was kept in the home, handled, spoken to, treated as a continued presence. Your ancestors did not grieve and move on. They grieved and stayed close. Modern Western death culture moves fast. The body is removed within hours. The funeral happens within a week. There is a brief, formal period of grief, and then there is pressure, social, professional, internal, to recover, to return, to be okay again. But for most of human history, grief was not a phase to pass through. It was a relationship to maintain. Consider the Torajan people of Sulawesi, Indonesia. One of the few living cultures that still practices something close to what your ancient ancestors did. In Torajan tradition, a dead family member is not considered fully dead for weeks, sometimes months, sometimes years after the body stops breathing. The deceased is referred to as a person who is sick. They are fed, they are spoken to. They are kept in the family home. Only after an elaborate funeral ceremony, which can require years of saving and the slaughter of dozens of buffalo, is the person considered to have truly passed. What the Torajan practice reveals is something that modern cultures have lost. The understanding that the transition from life to death is not an event. It is a process. A slow, communal, emotionally necessary process that the living must travel through together. Your brain already knows this. That is why you dream about people after they die. That is why you still reach for your phone to text someone who is gone. That is why grief comes in waves, months and years after a loss, not just in the days immediately following. Your nervous system was shaped by ancestors for whom the dead remained present. And it has not caught up to a world that moves them away so quickly. There is one more thing. Something found at site after site, from Neanderthal caves to Cro-Magnon burials to Neolithic tombs. Something so consistent across time and culture that it seems almost impossible to explain as coincidence. The bodies are almost always placed in the fetal position, knees drawn up, arms folded, head tilted slightly down, the same shape you occupied before you were born. No one knows with certainty what this means. But the people placing those bodies knew exactly what they were doing. Again and again, across hundreds of thousands of years, they made the same choice: to return the dead to the shape of the unborn, to fold them back into the posture of beginning. What you do with your dead says everything about what you believe about life. It says what you think a person is. It says what you think happens next. Your ancestors carried their dead into deep caves. They covered them in flowers and beads and red ochre. They kept their bones. They fed them and spoke to them and refused, for as long as they possibly could, to let go. Tonight, if you are missing someone, you are doing something ancient. You are doing what humans have always done. You are insisting, against all evidence to the contrary, that the people who mattered to you still do.